It all started when my neighbor, Steve, decided to turn his hobby of gardening into a full-time obsession. Now, don't get me wrong, everyone has their quirks, but Steve's obsession with his yard crossed every boundary of normal. It wasn't enough for him to maintain a beautiful garden. He had to make sure that my yard, specifically the small patch of land near my fence, looked like an eyesore compared to his. And he didn't just stop there. Every time I tried to enjoy a quiet moment in my own backyard, there he was, lurking on the edge of my property, peering over the fence like he was checking for some sort of imperfection in my yard. At first, I thought it was harmless, maybe just an annoying habit. But over time, it became clear that Steve wasn't just an overenthusiastic gardener. He was an overbearing neighbor with a need to control. He'd make comments, uninvited, about how my plants could be better or how the leaves on my trees were too unruly. I tried to be patient at first, chalking it up to him just being a little too particular about his space, but when he started to trespass onto my property, things took a turn. It was a Sunday morning when I first caught him in the act. I was out on my porch enjoying my coffee when I noticed Steve standing right by the side of my house, practically touching my fence. I called out to him, but he didn't even flinch. He was too busy looking at the corner of my yard where my garden shed sat. I went over to confront him, and when he saw me coming, he just casually stepped back, as if he hadn't just crossed a line. "Oh, just making sure your garden's still on track," he said with a smile, as if that made it okay. I told him, firmly, that my property was off limits, and he needed to respect my space. He nodded, but I could see in his eyes that this wasn't the last time he'd do something like this. That's when I decided to take action. I knew Steve well enough to understand that talking to him directly wouldn't do anything. He had that condescending attitude that convinced him he was always in the right. So, I started thinking of ways to make him regret ever setting foot on my property again. Now, I have a rather unique asset on my property, an ostrich. Her name is Gertrude, and while she's not the typical farm animal, she's one of the most entertaining creatures I've ever owned. Gertrude's a bit of a free spirit, and she doesn't like being told what to do, especially when it comes to boundaries. So, I hatched a plan. I started letting Gertrude roam freely in my yard, especially near the fence that bordered Steve's property. The first time he came over to snoop around, Gertrude, curious as always, wandered up to him. He was so surprised to see a giant bird appear out of nowhere that he froze. For a second, he didn't know what to do. And when Gertrude started pecking at the grass right next to him, Steve quickly realized he wasn't the one in control anymore. But this wasn't enough to get him to stay away completely. He'd keep coming back, probably thinking that his presence would intimidate me, so I had to take things further. The next time he tried trespassing, I decided to let Gertrude loose a little earlier in the day. As Steve strolled over to the edge of the fence, thinking I wasn't watching, Gertrude took the opportunity to sprint full speed across the yard and directly toward him. The look on his face as this massive bird charged at him was priceless. He jumped back so quickly, he almost tripped over his own feet. For a moment, I thought he might actually fall, but his feet scrambled in panic as he barely managed to stay on his feet. Gertrude, however, didn't stop. She chased him, honking loudly as she got closer. Steve turned and ran as fast as he could, his face a mix of shock and pure terror. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he yelled, but I couldn't help but laugh. It was the most satisfying thing I'd seen in weeks. After that day, I thought Steve might finally get the message. But no, he was relentless. A few days later, I saw him again, standing at the fence and eyeing Gertrude as if he was plotting his next move. I wasn't having it anymore. I wasn't just going to sit by and let this man continually violate my privacy. I decided to make things even more uncomfortable for him. I started sending Gertrude out to the fence every time I saw Steve lurking around. It became a routine. Every time he got too close, Gertrude would charge at him, honking loudly and flapping her wings in a way that made her seem even bigger. I could tell he was starting to get scared. And just when I thought things couldn't get any more amusing, Steve made the biggest mistake of all. One afternoon, as I was relaxing in my hammock, I saw him standing in my yard, not just by the fence this time, but right in front of my shed. Gertrude wasn't anywhere near the fence, so I knew it was now or never. I grabbed a bucket of water and started pouring it near the shed, catching Steve's attention. He turned to look at me, and before he could say anything, I shouted out to him, "If you keep trespassing on my property, I'll make sure Gertrude has a reason to come after you every single time." Steve's eyes widened. He looked back at the fence, then back at me, and the realization hit him. He was done. He didn't know it yet, but his days of trespassing were officially over. From that point on, he avoided my property at all costs, probably too embarrassed to show his face again. And just to be sure, Gertrude was always there, guarding the fence like the proud ostrich she was. Steve learned the hard way that you don't mess with someone's peace and privacy, especially not when you're dealing with an ostrich who doesn't take too kindly to trespassers. Steve had learned his lesson, or so I thought. For a while, there was peace. He kept his distance, barely even glancing at my property when he walked by. But as time passed, I realized he wasn't truly finished with his habit of overstepping boundaries. He just wasn't doing it on my property anymore. Instead, he started complaining to other neighbors about Gertrude. He told anyone who would listen that she was a danger, that I was irresponsible for having such an aggressive bird on my land. He even went so far as to suggest that I was violating some obscure neighborhood law about having potentially hazardous animals. It was clear that Steve hadn't given up. He just shifted his focus to ruining my reputation, hoping that I would be pressured into getting rid of Gertrude. His complaints didn't stop there. He started leaving passive-aggressive notes on my door, warning me that my animal was causing a disturbance, even though the only disturbance was Steve's constant attempts to invade my privacy. The notes were full of absurd complaints, ranging from "the bird's honking is too loud" to "the animal makes the neighborhood unsafe for children," neither of which had any merit. But Steve knew that people like to avoid conflict, so he thought he could play the part of the concerned neighbor and get everyone on his side. It was infuriating, and I wasn't about to let him turn my peaceful life into a battlefield. Instead of confronting him directly, I decided to turn the tables once again. I knew Steve's pride was one of his weakest points, and I realized that I could use that against him. I started getting creative with Gertrude's routine. Whenever I saw Steve standing near my fence, I deliberately let Gertrude wander into the front yard, making sure she could be seen from his house. Sometimes, I'd even place her near the edge of the driveway, right where he'd park, just to remind him who was in control. Her long legs and towering presence made her hard to miss, and I made sure Steve knew she was there, watching him. It wasn't long before he started avoiding his own driveway, parking a block away just to stay out of her sight. That small victory felt sweet, but I wasn't done yet. The real turning point came when I decided to host a neighborhood barbecue. I figured if I was going to make Steve's life a little miserable, I might as well do it publicly. The invitation was simple enough, a casual get-together to celebrate the summer, but I made sure to include a few choice details. Gertrude was going to be the star of the show. I set up a small pen near the grill, making it clear that Gertrude was going to be part of the event. It wasn't just a barbecue, it was a statement. I knew Steve wouldn't be able to resist showing up, even if he didn't want to be seen near Gertrude. His need to control everything meant he'd try to make an appearance to monitor the event, just as he had tried to do with my yard. When Steve arrived, his eyes immediately locked onto the pen where Gertrude was pecking at some corn. She wasn't as aggressive this time, but I could tell he was uneasy. I could almost feel the tension in the air as he tried to make small talk with some of the other neighbors. But his attention kept drifting back to the bird. I made sure to point out how Gertrude was just a harmless animal, and that she wasn't a danger to anyone, just a quirky companion. But Steve wasn't having it. He began to complain loudly about the disturbance she was causing. His voice carried across the yard, drawing the attention of several neighbors. I could see their eyes widen as Steve, who had been making himself a nuisance in the neighborhood for months, suddenly became the center of attention. It was almost as if the entire neighborhood was waiting for him to slip up, and slip up he did. At one point, he tried to educate everyone about how dangerous ostriches could be, using all the knowledge he'd gathered from Google searches. He painted himself as the expert, speaking in that patronizing tone he loved so much, but no one was buying it. I noticed several neighbors shaking their heads, and a few of them started quietly discussing how Steve had been acting strange for a while. It was clear that my little barbecue had become an impromptu intervention. Steve, realizing his audience wasn't on his side, tried to make his exit. But as he turned to leave, Gertrude, ever the opportunist, gave a loud honk and strutted right toward him. Steve froze, a bead of sweat forming on his forehead as the giant bird approached him with that confident swagger only an ostrich could have. I could barely contain my laughter as Steve backed away slowly, his eyes locked on Gertrude as if she were about to chase him down the street. He stumbled over his feet and nearly fell in the process, his dignity lost as the rest of the neighbors stood in stunned silence. It was in that moment that I knew this had gone from a simple neighbor dispute to something much bigger. Gertrude had become more than just a deterrent. She had become a symbol of resistance. Steve's reign of subtle intimidation had come to an abrupt end, and I wasn't going to let him recover from this embarrassment anytime soon. That day, as the neighbors gathered to enjoy the food, I overheard them talking about Steve in hushed tones. His reputation as the neighborhood busybody had finally caught up with him. The same people who had once avoided conflict now started avoiding him, and he found himself increasingly isolated. What made it all the more satisfying was the fact that Gertrude, the once ignored bird, had turned into the unlikely hero. Her presence had shifted the power dynamic in the neighborhood, and Steve was no longer the one in control. In the end, it was clear. You don't mess with someone who has an ostrich on their side. Steve, now completely on the defensive, realized that his little neighborhood empire was crumbling. No one wanted to interact with him anymore, and his attempts to regain control through petty complaints only seemed to backfire. As the days passed, I saw him grow more reclusive. He stopped making his daily walks around the neighborhood, and his once impressive garden seemed to lose its luster. People stopped engaging with him altogether, and it became clear that the power dynamic had shifted. He wasn't the annoying neighbor everyone feared. Now, he was the outcast, the one everyone avoided. But my work wasn't done just yet. I wasn't content with Steve simply avoiding me. I wanted him to truly feel the consequences of his actions. The real fun started when I decided to take the next step, making sure he never dared to step foot on my property again. I knew that a little nuisance could go a long way in teaching a lesson. I started doing something simple but incredibly effective. I began planting thorny bushes along the edges of my yard, just near the fence where Steve used to peer over. These bushes weren't just a barrier, they were a message. Every time Steve came close to my yard, he'd have to face those thorns, reminding him that he wasn't welcome. It wasn't violent, it wasn't dramatic, it was just a quiet, constant reminder that my space was mine, and he had no right to encroach on it. Steve must have noticed the change because one day I saw him standing at the fence again, just staring at the bushes. I could see the frustration in his face, the way he clenched his fists, but there was nothing he could do. He couldn't complain about a plant. He couldn't call anyone to take action. The thorns weren't a violation of any rules. They were just nature standing between him and my peace. And it was working. Steve never once came close to my property again. As time went on, the neighborhood began to look very different. Without Steve causing tension, the atmosphere became more relaxed, more communal. People started chatting more, helping each other out, and even hosting gatherings. The once tight-knit but tense neighborhood transformed into a genuinely friendly place. Gertrude, for all her oddness, had played a big role in that change. Her presence had inadvertently united the neighbors, showing them that standing up to a bully didn't require violence or conflict. It just took a little bit of creativity and a lot of patience. Steve's absence from these gatherings was undeniable. It wasn't that he was hated, it was simply that he wasn't part of the new, more inclusive vibe. He had pushed too far, and his self-imposed exile was his punishment. Months later, I noticed Steve's house was up for sale. There was no grand announcement, no farewell party. It was almost as if he had quietly given up, retreating to wherever he could find solace without the constant reminder of his failures. His house sold quickly, and a new family that moved in was the complete opposite of Steve. They were warm, friendly, and welcomed the neighborhood with open arms. The best part? They had a small child who instantly took a liking to Gertrude, feeding her carrots from their garden. A full circle moment from the days when Steve tried to make my ostrich out to be a menace. Gertrude, always the star of the show, was now the neighborhood's beloved mascot. Looking back, I realized that dealing with Steve had taught me a valuable lesson. You don't need to engage in petty drama to win. Sometimes, all it takes is a bit of patience, a quirky animal, and the courage to defend your space when someone tries to take it away. Gertrude wasn't just an ostrich. She had become a symbol of standing your ground, of protecting your privacy, and of showing that even the smallest, most unexpected actions can make a difference. As for Steve, I'm sure he learned a lesson, though I doubt he'll ever admit it. He'll probably move on to the next neighborhood, where he can continue his attempts to control others. But the truth is, he'll always remember the lesson I taught him. And that, in itself, was the sweetest revenge. The real reward came from the peace that followed. No more unwanted visits, no more complaints, and best of all, no more Steve. The neighborhood had finally found its harmony, and I could enjoy my space, complete with Gertrude, without worrying about anyone trying to ruin it. Sometimes, the best way to deal with a trespasser is to let an ostrich handle it.